Get your hands off that menu. Children like him don't dine here. Vivienne Ashford said those words standing over a 9-year-old boy in a white linen dining room on the 14th floor of a glass tower in the heart of Chicago. Her voice did not waver. It did not drop to a whisper or soften at the edges, the way a person's voice does when they are uncertain. It carried. Across the nearest tables, past the low candlelight, through the soft notes of a jazz quartet that had not yet understood what they were hearing. Her voice moved through that room the way a cold draft moves through a warm house. You felt it before you could explain it. She snatched the leather menu from the boy's fingers and held it against her chest like she was protecting something that belonged to her. She looked at the boy the way certain people look at things that have appeared in the wrong place. Not with fury, with correction. The calm, absolute certainty of someone who has decided, before a single word is spoken, that they already know everything they need to know. The boy looked up at her. He did not flinch. He did not pull his hands back and tuck them under the table. He looked directly at her with eyes that were steady and clear, and older than 9 years had any right to make them. "My grandmother made a reservation," he said. "We are supposed to be here." Vivienne leaned down close. Her perfume was thick and expensive, the kind that arrives in a room before the person wearing it does. Her smile was thin and practiced and carried no warmth at all. "Reservations can be canceled," she said. "Oh, especially when someone has clearly wandered into the wrong establishment." She straightened up and looked toward the entrance where the maitre d' stood near the host stand. "Jerome, please find these guests a more suitable arrangement." 20 tables of guests watched. Forks had stopped moving. Glasses had stopped being lifted. The quartet turned a quiet corner into a new measure, and the music kept going because the musicians were too far away to hear the words clearly and too professional to stop playing over a disturbance they had not yet confirmed. Nobody at those 20 tables moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody pushed back their chair and stood up. She had absolutely no idea whose grandson she had just humiliated. 6 hours earlier, the morning light moved slow and golden through a brownstone townhouse in the Hyde Park neighborhood of Chicago. The kind of home that does not announce itself. No grand entrance, no statement architecture, nothing built to make a stranger stop on the sidewalk and stare. Just a solid, warm, lived-in building on a tree-lined street where the roots of the elm trees had been pushing up the sidewalk squares for 30 years, and the city kept patching them, and the trees kept pushing, and nobody had won yet. Inside, the home told its story without trying. Bookshelves ran floor to ceiling in the front hallway, paperbacks and hardcovers mixed without system, spine colors bleeding into each other like a quilt. A piano sat in the front room, sheet music open on the stand to a hymn that had been there so long the pages had curled at the corners. A collection of small clay figurines on the windowsill, each one made by a different hand at a different age, some crude, some careful, all kept. Photographs in mismatched frames covering the length of the hallway wall, because the frames had never mattered, only the moments inside them. Birthday parties with paper hats and frosting smeared faces. A fishing trip where the only thing caught was a sunburn. A little boy in a too big winter coat standing in front of a snowman that was already leaning. A woman in a white chef's coat standing in a kitchen that was not yet finished, laughing at something just outside the frame, her eyes bright, her hands flurry, the whole world apparently hilarious. Marcus Webb sat at the kitchen table eating oatmeal with brown sugar and sliced peaches. 9 years old, small for his age but not fragile, with the kind of small that is compact rather than diminished, patient eyes that moved slowly and landed fully on whatever they settled on, the way his mother's eyes had moved, the way he had inherited without knowing it. A library book lay open beside his bowl, already on chapter 4. He had started it 2 days ago. He would finish it by Thursday. His grandmother had pressed his shirt the night before. His shoes were tied twice in double knots the way she had taught him. His hair was neat. He had checked it himself in the bathroom mirror 3 times that morning, not out of vanity, but out of care. Today was the day she had been promising him for 3 months, and he wanted to show up to it right. In the next room, a calm voice moved through a half-open door, unhurried and precise. The kind of voice that had learned over many years that volume is not the same as authority. Fourth quarter revenue projections. The Nashville location's soft opening timeline pushed to the second week of February. A new partnership inquiry from a hospitality group in London that needed a response by end of week. A staffing issue at the New Orleans location that had been escalating for 10 days and needed to be resolved before it became a headline. Claudette Webb stood at her kitchen counter with her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and her phone pressed to her ear. 61 years old. Silver locks pinned back from her face with 2 tortoiseshell clips, the same ones she had owned for 12 years. A woman whose face had been softened and deepened by time in equal measure. The lines around her eyes belonging there, the way rings belong in the trunk of a tree, each one a record of something lived through. She wore a dark green cardigan over a white blouse, and she was barefoot on the kitchen tile because she had not yet decided what shoes she was wearing to dinner, and she saw no reason to commit to footwear before noon. She had not raised her voice in a business meeting in over a decade. She had learned long ago that quiet authority travels further than volume, that a room will lean toward a whisper faster than it will follow a shout, that the most dangerous thing a woman in her position could do was let someone else set the temperature of the conversation. So she had stopped doing that somewhere around her 44th year, and she had not looked back. 34 years ago, Claudette Webb opened a 12-seat soul food restaurant in a borrowed storefront on the south side of Chicago. The storefront belonged to a woman named Ida Cross, who ran a seamstress shop in the front and let Claudette use the back room on evenings and weekends for a percentage of the take and a standing order of sweet potato pie. Claudette had $4,000 saved from 3 years of working double shifts at a hotel kitchen downtown. She had a handwritten menu on index cards. She had a belief, simple and unshakable, that food prepared with love deserved to be eaten with dignity, that a plate of well-made food set before a person was an act of respect, and that the neighborhoods that fed this city deserved to be fed back. She named it the Webb Table. She made everything herself the first year, sourced her produce from 2 farmers she had met at the Maxwell Street Market, rendered her own lard, made her cornbread from a recipe her mother had carried out of Mississippi in her memory because there had been no room in the one suitcase for a recipe book. The first year, she nearly lost everything twice. Once when the pipes in the back room froze in February, and she spent 4 days cooking out of Ida's front room with an electric skillet and a prayer. Once when a health inspector cited her for a ventilation issue that cost her $1,100 she did not have, and she paid it in installments over 4 months while her savings account read a number that made her stomach hurt every time she looked at it. The second year, she broke even. The third year, she hired her first employee, a teenager from the block named Rodney, who washed dishes and became, over the following decade, one of the best pastry chefs in the city. By the 5th year, there was a line outside the door every Friday night. By the 10th year, the Webb Table had a second location. By the 15th year, 3. Today, Webb Hospitality Group owned 11 restaurants across 6 cities, fine dining and neighborhood bistros, and a rooftop bar in Atlanta that had been written up in 4 national publications and a supper club in New Orleans, where the waiting list for a Saturday reservation was longer than some people's patience. The flagship, a destination restaurant simply called Claudette's, sat on the 14th floor of a glass tower in Chicago's River North neighborhood. 6-week reservation wait. A James Beard Award displayed in a shadow box near the host stand, not prominently, not at eye level, just present, the way a person with genuine confidence wears their accomplishments. Claudette's name was on the building. Her recipes were in the kitchen. Her signature was on every training manual her staff had ever read. Her standards were in the bones of every room her company had ever built. She owned every table in that 14th floor dining room, every chair, every fork, every candle, every window with a view of the Chicago skyline pressing close on 3 sides like the city was trying to look in. But you would never know any of that by watching her move through her own kitchen that Saturday morning. She rinsed Marcus's bowl before he could reach the sink. She asked him twice if he had used the bathroom. She cut an extra peach into slices and set the plate in front of him without being asked, and then stood at the counter drinking her coffee and watching him read his book and listening to the quiet of the house settle around them both like something she was still learning to accept. Marcus's mother, Denise Webb, had died 18 months earlier, a stroke at 37 years old, fast and without warning and without any mercy at all, the way the worst losses arrive, already complete before you have had a single moment to prepare. Marcus had been at school. Claudette had been in a meeting. By the time they reached the hospital, there was nothing left to decide, only things to absorb. Marcus moved into Claudette's townhouse the following week. He brought his library card in his backpack and a framed photograph of his mother laughing at a birthday party, her head thrown back, her eyes closed, her whole body given over to whatever was funny, uninhibited, and full and alive. He set the photograph on the nightstand in the small bedroom at the end of the hall, and he had not moved it since. Claudette had not allowed herself to fall apart, not in front of him. She understood that grief is not a private event when a child is watching, that what she showed him in those first weeks would become part of the architecture of how he understood loss for the rest of his life. So she had been steady. She had been present. She had packed lunches and attended school conferences and read aloud at bedtime and answered every question he asked about his mother with the fullest truth she could offer, without making the truth a weight too heavy for a 9-year-old to carry. She had been the floor under his feet when everything else had given way. That was the job now. The restaurants were important. The company was important. 34 years of work and risk and reinvention were important. But this was the only job that mattered. Tonight's reservation had been Denise's idea, in a way. 3 months before she died, in one of those ordinary conversations that become unbearably precious in retrospect, Denise had told Marcus that one day she would take him to Claudette's for his birthday. A real dinner, she had said, dressed up, the good water glasses. He had talked about it with the tenacity children reserve for promises they intend to collect on. He mentioned it the week after the funeral. He mentioned it at Thanksgiving. He mentioned it in February when Claudette was reviewing the spring menu changes, and he appeared in the doorway of her home office in his pajamas to ask if his birthday counted as a special occasion. So Claudette had made the reservation herself. Table for two, her restaurant, her grandson, her daughter's promise, kept by the only person left who could keep it. By 4 o'clock, Marcus was standing at the front door with his coat already on, in 15 minutes to spare, turning his sleeve cuff over and over in his fingers, the way he did when he was trying to contain something that wanted to be larger than the moment allowed. Claudette came down the stairs in a charcoal wool dress and low heels, and the silver earrings Denise had given her for her 58th birthday. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked at her grandson, standing at the door in his pressed shirt and his double-knotted shoes and his careful hair. And she felt something move through her chest that she did not have a clean word for. Not sadness exactly, not joy exactly. The place where both of those things lived when they occupied the same moment. She picked up her purse. She said, "You look handsome." Marcus said, "You look nice too, Grandma." They walked out into the early evening together, and the elm tree on the sidewalk threw its long winter shadow across the front steps, and the city hummed around them. When neither of them said anything else for a while, because sometimes the right thing to do with an important moment is simply to be inside it. Claudette's occupied the entire 14th floor of a glass tower on Wabash Avenue, and the view from the windows on a clear winter evening was the kind of thing that made people set down their forks mid-bite and just look. The city spread outward in every direction, light stacked on light, the river catching the reflection of the buildings above it, the L tracks threading between structures with a kind of purposeful grace, the sky above it all going from the last deep blue of dusk into the first true black of night as the stars found their positions one by one. Inside, the room moved with intention, cream linen tablecloths pressed flat and smooth, candles burning low and steady in short glass holders, their light warm and directional, touching faces rather than flooding the room. A jazz quartet in the far corner, a piano and a bass and a brush snare, and a muted trumpet, playing something that was neither too present nor too absent, the sonic equivalent of excellent temperature in a room. Servers in black jackets moved between tables with the quiet, unhurried precision of people who understood that good service is invisible when it is working and catastrophic when it is not. The reservation was under Webb, table 12, window side east-facing, the best view of the river. Claudette had not requested it specifically. Gerald Payne had noted the reservation when it came through the system and had assigned that table himself without being asked. Because he had worked for Claudette Webb for 17 years and he understood certain things implicitly. The host at the entrance was a young man named Caleb Reeves, 23 years old, 11 months into his job at Claudette's, trained with a thoroughness that characterized every front-of-house hire the company made. He smiled when Claudette and Marcus walked through the door, the genuine smile of someone who found their work meaningful and had not yet had enough bad shifts to lose the edge of that meaning. He checked the reservation, confirmed table 12, and led them across the floor with the ease of someone who knew every table in the room by muscle memory. He pulled out Claudette's chair. He placed the leather menu in Marcus's hands with both of his own hands, the way he had been trained. When an offering rather than a transaction. He told them their server would be right over and that the kitchen had a wonderful duck preparation on the menu this evening that had been very well received. He did not hesitate at any point. He did not recalibrate when he saw them. He looked at a grandmother and her grandson dressed for a nice dinner, and he saw exactly what they were. He had been trained by people trained by Claudette Webb herself, and that training had taken. But Caleb was not working the floor that night. He was at the host stand. The floor was Vivienne Ashford's. Vivienne had been floor manager at Claudette's for 6 years. She had come to the position with 31 years of hospitality experience behind her, much of it in European fine dining establishments in New York and Chicago. These places where the aesthetic of exclusivity had been so deeply built into the culture that it had become invisible, ambient, indistinguishable from the concept of quality itself. She was mid-50s, sharp-featured, impeccably postured, the kind of person who entered a room and immediately assessed it, cataloged it, determined what was in order, and what required her correction. She was, by every measurable professional standard, excellent at her job. She knew wine. She knew table management. She knew how to move a difficult guest from frustration to satisfaction in 4 minutes flat. She could read a room's rhythm and adjust service timing the way a conductor adjusts tempo, intuitively and invisibly. Her staff respected her precision. Her numbers were always strong, and she had, over 6 years at Claudette's, had developed a pattern so quiet and so consistent and so carefully deniable that it had accumulated 6 formal complaints in the company's guest feedback system and resulted in 0 formal reprimands because each individual incident, examined alone and in isolation, looked like a judgment call, a professional assessment, a matter of floor management discretion. It was only when you laid all 6 side by side that the shape of it became clear. The way a single scratch on a wall means nothing, but the same scratch repeated in the same direction 30 times tells you something about the person holding the key. She was moving through the floor when Caleb led Claudette and Marcus to table 12. She was near the service station by the east wall, reviewing a server's floor notes, and she looked up the way she always looked up when someone new was being seated in her section, out of habit, out of the constant low-level surveillance that floor management requires. She looked at the woman in the charcoal dress. She looked at the boy in the pressed shirt. She took in Marcus's braids, his age, his shoes, his small fingers reaching for the leather menu with the gold C embossed on the front cover. She set down the floor notes. She crossed the room. "Get your hands off that menu. Children like him don't dine here." She pulled it from Marcus's hands before Claudette could react. The table went still. The nearest tables went still. The quiet spread outward in a slow ring like something dropped into water. Claudette set down the water glass she had just been handed. She looked at Vivienne with an expression that was not shock, because Claudette Webb had lived 61 years in this country and in this body, and shock was not the word for what she felt when things like this happened. What she felt was something older and more exhausted than shock, a recognition, a wariness that she carried the way you carry something you have been carrying so long you no longer notice the weight until someone forces you to set it down and look at it. "Is there a problem?" Her voice was even, measured, a question, not a confrontation. Vivienne turned to her with the practiced patience of someone explaining something they consider obvious. "We maintain a very specific atmosphere here," she said. "This is a destination dining experience. It requires a level of composure that is not always appropriate for young children. I'm sure you understand. He is 9 years old. He is sitting quietly. He has not done a single thing." Vivienne tilted her head at a slight angle, the gesture of someone absorbing an objection and setting it aside. We've had situations before, she said. Disruptions that affect the experience of other guests. I'm sure there are wonderful family-friendly options in the neighborhood. I would be happy to suggest a few places that might be more suitable. The word suitable landed in the air between them and stayed there. Claudette looked at Vivienne. Then she looked at Marcus. He had not moved since the menu was taken from his hands. He was sitting with his hands folded in his lap, his eyes directed at the white tablecloth in front of him. And he was doing the thing that Claudette recognized and that broke something in her every single time she saw it. He was making himself smaller. He was pulling inward, compressing, becoming as unobtrusive as possible, because he had already learned at 9 years old the way Black children learn things like this, not from a lesson or a conversation, but from an accumulation of moments exactly like this one, that when certain people look at you with that expression, the safest thing to do is to take up less space. Denise had learned that same instinct. Claudette had spent decades trying to unlearn it herself. She set her purse on the table. Her voice did not change. It stayed exactly where it had been, low and unhurried, and without a single degree of temperature that was not intentional. We will not be moving, she said. Vivienne's eyes sharpened. Her chin came up a fraction of an inch. Ma'am, I don't want this to become unpleasant. Then don't make it unpleasant. Bring my grandson his menu. A pause. The quartet kept playing. Someone at a table by the west window laughed softly at something their companion had said. The candles held their light without flickering. The city pressed against the glass outside, indifferent and enormous and continuous. Vivienne's expression did not break, but something behind it shifted. The way a surface shifts when the thing beneath it is no longer fully stationary. She had managed this floor for 6 years. She had moved difficult guests, diffused complaints, redirected situations that threatened the room's equilibrium. She had always been the authority in this space. One, she had never once been told no by someone she had already assessed as not belonging here. The no itself was not the problem. It was the steadiness with which it had been delivered, the absence of apology or negotiation in it. That steadiness did not match the picture she had already drawn. She leaned down. Her voice dropped to the register she used when she wanted words to travel no further than the person in front of her. I don't know who told you this was the kind of establishment that accommodates walk-ins, she said. But I will tell you this once. Take the boy and leave quietly, or I will have security escort you out, and we will not be discussing it any further. Claudette looked up at her. She looked at her the way a woman looks at something she has seen 100 times across the full length of her life and is no longer surprised by, no longer destabilized by, has already in the time it took to draw one breath decided exactly how to handle. She said nothing. She reached into her purse and placed her phone face up on the table. She made one call. The man who answered was named Gerald Payne, Senior Director of Operations for Webb Hospitality Group, 52 years old, 22 years in the hospitality industry, 17 of them working for Claudette, the last 9 in his current role. He picked up on the second ring. Claudette's voice was quiet. Gerald, I'm at the restaurant. Table 12. I need you downstairs in 4 minutes. He did not ask what for, and he did not ask if everything was all right or whether she was sure or whether it could wait. He had worked with this woman for 17 years, and he knew the frequency of this particular tone the way a musician knows a key change before it resolves. He was already standing up from his desk in the operations center 2 blocks away by the time she ended the call. He was at the host stand in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. While he was in transit, the room continued to sit in the particular suspended tension that follows a public confrontation that has not yet found its resolution. Vivienne had stepped back from table 12, but had not gone far. She stood at the service station with her arms crossed and her eyes moving between the door and the table, running the calculus of the situation. We still confident in the architecture of her authority, even as something in the room's air had changed in a way she had not yet fully read. At the table nearest to 12, a woman named Patricia Odom sat with her daughter Renee. Patricia was 63 years old. She had spent 28 years as a registered nurse at a hospital on the South Side, had held hands through diagnoses and through the last hours of lives, and through the particular kind of grief that descends at 2 a.m. when the family has finally understood what the doctors have been saying for 3 days. She had a gift for reading rooms that had been sharpened by decades of professional necessity. The ability to walk into a space and understand its emotional weather in seconds, to know where the distress was and what it needed and what would make it worse. So she had seen the menu get taken. She had heard every word of the exchange. She had watched Marcus fold his hands into his lap and drop his eyes to the tablecloth. She recognized that gesture with the bone-deep recognition of a woman who had seen it performed by too many children in too many rooms across too many years. She leaned across the table toward Renee and said, quietly but not quietly enough, "That child did not do one thing wrong. Not one thing." Renee had already taken out her phone. The recording had been running for 4 minutes. In the corner near the window, a man named Douglas Hale sat alone with a glass of burgundy and a small leather notebook. 67 years old. 40 years teaching African American history and cultural studies at Northwestern University. Now emeritus, but still writing, and still appearing at conferences, still filling notebooks with the slow, steady accumulation of a mind that had never learned how to stop observing. He visited Claudette's 4 times a year, had done so for 11 years. He had known Claudette Webb by name and reputation for longer than that. He had watched the entire exchange from 30 feet away, with the expression of a man who was watching something be confirmed that he had been documenting for decades. He closed his notebook. He did not put it in his bag. Gerald Payne came through the entrance and moved directly to table 12. He took one look at Claudette. He took one look at Marcus. He looked at the empty space in front of Marcus where a menu should have been. He turned to find Vivienne and found her already moving toward him from the service station, her chin up. Her posture assembled, ready to manage this the way she had managed every other friction point in 6 years. "Gerald," she said, "I was managing a guest situation in accordance with standard floor policy. There was a concern about appropriateness for—" Gerald raised one hand, palm open, fingers steady. The gesture of a man who has heard enough to know he does not need more. He turned to Vivienne, and he spoke in a voice that was not loud and was not theatrical and carried no performance of authority because it had no need of performance. "This is Claudette Webb," he said. "She is the founder and sole owner of this restaurant group. Every restaurant in the group, this building, this floor, this table, every menu in this room. Her name is on the lease, the business license, the deed, and the award in the shadow box by the host stand. She built this restaurant from a 12-seat storefront on the South Side 34 years ago, and she has owned every room she has ever walked into since." He paused. "Let the weight of that settle. The reservation under Webb at table 12 is not a regular guest reservation. It is the owner of this establishment dining in her own restaurant with her grandson for his birthday." The room had gone very quiet. The quartet was still playing, but something about the quality of the silence around the music had changed. It was the silence of 20 tables of people who understood that they were watching something that they would be describing for a long time. Vivienne's composure held for 2 more seconds. Then it began to come apart in the way expensive things come apart, slowly and in pieces and with a kind of terrible precision. "Mr. Payne," she said, "I had no way of knowing who she—" "You had every way of knowing." Gerald's voice did not rise. That was the thing about it. It stayed exactly where it was, even and clear and without a single degree of mercy in it. A reservation under the name Webb in this building should have prompted every reasonable inquiry before you approach that table. But beyond that, and more importantly than that, a 9-year-old boy sitting quietly with his grandmother at a window table, dressed for a dinner she promised him, told you everything a person with the professional judgment you have been trusted with should have needed to know, and you still made this choice. Vivienne looked at Claudette, and then the words came out. The wrong words in the wrong order, at the worst possible moment, and are the words that would follow her for the rest of her professional life and out the other side of it. "If I had known who you were," she said, "this never would have happened." The room heard it. Patricia Odom's fork touched the edge of her plate and was still. Douglas Hale opened his notebook. Renee lowered her phone slightly and then raised it again. The recording light blinked on. Claudette looked at Vivienne. Her expression did not change. Her voice stayed exactly where it had been all evening, low and unhurried and without a single wasted syllable. "That," she said, "is exactly the problem." She let it stand. She let the room hold it. Then she turned to Marcus, who had been sitting through all of it with his hands still folded in his lap and his eyes still on the tablecloth. Absorbing the weight of being 9 years old and the subject of a room's attention in the worst way. Claudette reached across the table and covered his hands with hers. "Look up, baby." Marcus looked up. "You see this room?" He looked around it. The candles, the linen, the city filling the windows. The faces at 20 tables turned toward him. He nodded. "I built it. Every part of it. The kitchen downstairs and the windows up here, and the chairs and the music, and the candles on every table. I started with $4,000 in a borrowed back room, and I built everything you are sitting inside of right now over 34 years. And I built it so that people who look like us could sit anywhere in it, any table, any chair, any window. You understand me?" His jaw was tight, but his eyes were steady. He nodded. "Hi, you were never in the wrong room. There is no room on this earth you don't belong in if you have earned your seat. And you have. You've been earning it your whole life just by being exactly who you are." She straightened. She looked at Gerald. Gerald was already on his phone. Vivienne Ashford was walked off the floor by Gerald Payne within the hour. Her manager key card was collected at the host stand. Her employee credentials were suspended on the spot pending a full internal review. She did not raise her voice. She did not make a scene. She walked through the service entrance because Gerald offered her the option, and she was already too diminished to argue about which door to use. Her heels were quiet on the tile going out. Nobody watched her leave. The review that followed was meticulous, and the operations team pulled Vivienne's complete employment record, 6 years of floor reports, incident logs, seating assignments, server briefing notes, guest feedback submissions, and the internal response history attached to every formal complaint that had been filed against her. What they found was not a single dramatic event. It was a pattern so consistent it could have been drawn with a ruler. 6 complaints across 6 years, all from guests of color, all filed through the company's guest feedback system, all routed through the standard internal review process, all closed with notations about insufficient evidence or crew discretion or standard floor management judgment. A black couple in their 40s dressed well, celebrating an anniversary, so seated near the kitchen pass-through on a slow Saturday night, while 3 window tables sat empty. Their complaint filed 2 days later, closed within a week. Insufficient evidence of discriminatory intent. A family whose reservation was listed twice in the system as lost or misrouted, both times on evenings when the dining room was at less than 60% capacity. Their complaint noting that they had called to confirm the reservation twice and been told both times it was in the system. Closed. Administrative error. A young black woman who documented waiting 11 minutes at the bar, while 3 other guests who arrived after her were served immediately. Closed. Service volume concerns noted. A Latino family asked on arrival whether they had understood that the restaurant was fine dining and whether they were comfortable with the price point, a question that Vivienne had apparently asked with the delivery of a professional courtesy, but that the family understood correctly for what it was. Closed. No corroborating documentation. 6 complaints. 6 closures. 0 formal reprimands. A 6-year record that was, on paper, spotless. In reality, it was a graveyard of buried grievances, each one interred with the same quiet efficiency. Each family returning to their lives with the knowledge that they had seen something clearly and been told they had not. 3 of those families were contacted directly by Webb Hospitality Group's legal team within 72 hours of the review opening. Each one answered the phone. Each one told a version of the same story. Different evenings, different tables, different specific words, the same woman, the same expression, the same outcome, and the same experience of filing a complaint and hearing nothing back that meant anything. One of them said, "I never thought anyone would actually listen." Renee Odom posted the video that same night, 6 minutes and 44 seconds of clear, unobstructed footage shot from table 11. Vivienne's voice carrying across the room, the menu being snatched, Marcus sitting still with his hands in his lap, Claudette's face, Gerald arriving, the specific sentence about not knowing who she was. All of it, exactly as it happened. posted at 11:17 that evening with a caption that was 4 sentences long and said everything it needed to say. By midnight, it had been seen 80,000 times. By 8 the following morning, 3 million. By the end of the week, the number had crossed 20 million and was not slowing. Douglas Hale was interviewed by 2 national news outlets. He had been dining at Claudette's for 11 years, he said. He had watched the whole thing from across the room. He had his notebook with him, he said, because he had spent 40 years documenting exactly this. The small, quiet, expensively dressed contempt that doesn't leave a visible mark until someone finally captures it and holds it still long enough for everyone to see the shape of it. Patricia Odom gave one interview to a local Chicago news station, sitting in her living room in the same South Side neighborhood where she had lived for 40 years. She said she had been a nurse for 28 years. She said she had spent her entire career making decisions in the space between what was happening and what should happen. She said that on the evening in question, she had looked at a 9-year-old boy having a menu pulled out of his hands in a restaurant his grandmother owned, and she had understood immediately and completely what was happening and why. She said that her daughter had started recording before she had finished her sentence about it. She said she was glad. Webb Hospitality Group issued its statement on day 4. Claudette wrote it herself. She wrote that Vivienne Ashford's employment with Webb Hospitality Group had been formally terminated, effective immediately, for discriminatory conduct toward guests, documented abuse of floor authority, and a pattern of behavior inconsistent with the values on which this company had been founded. She wrote that the 6 prior complaints against Ms. Ashford had been reviewed in full and that the company's internal complaint process had failed the guests who filed them. She wrote that each of those guests had been contacted personally by herself and by the company's legal team, and that each would receive a formal written apology, a full settlement for damages, and a standing invitation to return. She wrote that the complaint review process was being redesigned from the ground up, and that an independent oversight board would be established to review all future guest complaints with binding authority. She wrote that no complaint would be closed without a direct personal response to the guest within 72 hours. She wrote one more paragraph, the one that was screenshotted and shared separately from the rest of the statement, and read by people who had never heard of Webb Hospitality Group and would not have known Claudette Webb's name before that week. She wrote that her grandson Marcus came to dinner that evening because his mother, her daughter Denise, had made him a promise she did not live long enough to keep. She wrote that the promise was about more than a nice restaurant or a window table or the good water glasses. It was about a little boy knowing that the world his grandmother built had a place in it for him, a seat that was already his, a room where no one would look at him and decide before he sat down what he was worth. She wrote that no child should have to prove that they belong, not in a restaurant, not in a school, not in a hospital or a boardroom or an airplane or any other room that human hands have made. She wrote that she had built 11 restaurants over 34 years, and every one of them had been built with the same intention, that a plate of food set before a person is an act of respect, and that the neighborhoods and the people and the children that fed this city deserve to be fed back. She signed it the way she signed everything. Claudette A. Webb, founder. The legal consequences came in the sequence that consequences come when the evidence is clear and the documentation is thorough, and the public has already reached its verdict. Vivienne Ashford's appeal to the State Labor Board was reviewed and denied. The investigator assigned to the case watched the video, read all 6 prior complaints. It reviewed the internal response history for each and found no grounds for reinstatement. 31 years in hospitality management ended in a conference room in Chicago on a gray Tuesday in February. The maitre d', Jerome Calder, who had begun moving toward table 12 in response to Vivienne's instruction before Gerald arrived, was placed on probation. He had not asked a single question before responding to her direction. He had not paused to assess the situation independently. His failure to exercise his own judgment in a moment that required it was noted formally in his employment record. He completed 60 hours of bias awareness and situational intervention training over the following 3 months. He finished it. He told the training facilitator in his exit evaluation that he had thought about that evening every day since it happened. The internal complaint process reform was completed 8 weeks after the incident. The new system was audited by an external equity consulting firm and certified before being implemented. Every complaint filed since its activation had received a personal response within 48 hours. The 3 families who had come forward received their settlements and their apologies. More than one of them said that the apology mattered more than the money. One of the women, the one who had waited 11 minutes at the bar, said she had told her husband when they got home that night 2 years ago that something was wrong in that room, and he had said she was probably reading too much into it. And she said she had always known she was not. 2 months after the dinner, Claudette's hosted an event on a Sunday afternoon when the restaurant was closed to regular guests. Tables had been rearranged. Chairs were set in an open configuration. There were 43 children in the room, ages 7 to 16, brought in from 4 community organizations on the South Side. Each child was given a menu, not a simplified version. The actual menu, leather cover, and gold C and all. They were told that tonight this room was theirs. They were served a full 3-course dinner, the same meal the restaurant served every evening to guests who had waited 6 weeks for a reservation. Servers in black jackets, candles at every table, the jazz quartet in the corner playing something warm, the city in the windows, all of it. Marcus sat at table 12. He had the duck, which he had decided on before they left the house that afternoon. He said it was the best thing he had ever eaten, which Claudette noted with quiet pride was exactly what the kitchen had been aiming for 11 years. He asked the server 3 questions about the preparation, and the server answered every one without checking a watch or looking toward the kitchen or doing any of the things adults do when they have decided a child's question is taking longer than it should. Claudette sat across from him, her reading glasses on, her hands folded, the city behind him through the window, the room full of children who had been told, by every detail of their treatment that evening, that they were welcome here, that they were the point of this room, and that a woman had spent 34 years building this place with them in mind. When the dessert plates were cleared, Marcus looked up at his grandmother. "Grandma, this is what Mom wanted." Claudette nodded. Her eyes were clear. Her voice did not waver. "I know, baby. That's exactly why we came." A woman named Patricia Odom sat at her kitchen table that same Sunday evening, a cup of tea cooling in front of her and her daughter's laptop open to the comments under the video. 20 million views now. She scrolled through slowly, reading. She had been a nurse for 28 years. She had stood at more bedsides than she could count and made more small decisions in high-pressure moments than any single memory could hold. She had learned that the difference between a room that heals and a room that harms is not the equipment in it. It is the person standing at the threshold deciding who is worth their full attention. She closed the laptop. She sat in the quiet of her kitchen for a while and thought about a boy in a pressed shirt folding his hands in his lap because someone had decided before he spoke a word that he did not belong, and how his grandmother had told him to look up, and how he had, and how his eyes had been steady, and how that steadiness had not come from nowhere, but from somewhere very specific. From a mother who was gone, from a grandmother who remained, from 34 years of a woman building rooms so that children would always have somewhere to stand. Patricia thought about the 20 tables that had gone still, and the one daughter at one table who had taken out her phone. 20 to 1. That was the ratio. Aaron, and it was the one that changed everything. If this story moved you, hit that like button and share it. Because Marcus's story is not rare. It happens in restaurants and hotel lobbies and school offices and doctors' waiting rooms. The only difference this time is that someone was watching and someone refused to stay silent, and a grandmother had spent 34 years building the room they were sitting in. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this. But before you go, I want you to sit with one question. If Claudette Webb had not owned that restaurant, would anyone have done anything at all? Drop your answer in the comments. Vivienne Ashford said that if she had known who Claudette was, none of it would have happened. And Claudette answered the only way the truth permits. And that is exactly the problem. Because a child's right to sit at a table should not depend on who his grandmother is. A 9-year-old boy dressed for a birthday dinner should not have to carry a credential. He should not have to prove anything to anyone before someone hands him a menu. But that is the world that was built, where 6 complaints disappear into a filing system, where one video reaches 20 million people in a week, where it took a woman owning the building before anyone decided she was worth listening to, Patricia Odom did not know Claudette Webb. She had no stake in what happened at that table. She was just a woman at dinner who saw a child being humiliated and decided that watching was not the same as witnessing, that her silence was a vote for the way things are. 20 tables sat still that night. Or one daughter held up a phone. 20-1. Those are the numbers that matter, because every time someone looks away, they cast a vote for the pattern, for the next child who walks into a room and is told without a word being spoken that this place was not made for you. Ask yourself honestly, if Marcus's grandmother had been a stranger, if she had been nobody's founder and nobody's owner, just a grandmother in a nice coat taking her grandson to a birthday dinner, would you have said something? Would anyone? Comment your truth. Share this with someone who needs to remember that their voice counts. Because silence is not neutral. It is always, always a choice.